They fired me for the pearl buttons. The boardroom smelled of lemon cleaner and old coffee, a thin fog of anxiety trapped under the high glassed ceiling. Cassidy smiled like a blade. She pinned me with the kind of attention reserved for art critics and petty monarchs, precise, theatrical, enjoying the little cruelty. "It's unprofessional," she said, tapping the cuff where a strand of ivory caught the light. "Our standards are clear." Behind her, the wall of the conference room reflected our faces back at us in the way glass does, slightly flatter, more brittle. The room had been scrubbed for this moment. The chair at the head of the table, my chair for 6 years, had been preordained for someone younger, somebody whose resume would be polished on the inside and stained on the outside in ways that wouldn't matter in the elevator. My promotion was an announcement on hold, an inbox subject line that had been floating on someone's lips for months. Tomorrow, the firm was expected to sign the term sheet for a $1.5 billion acquisition. My work, my quiet hours of negotiation, my margins and dependencies, the conditional wording that kept vultures at bay, lived in the corners of conversations that I had kept alive. They were not all in the server. They were a network, a set of soft assurances. I was the one who had answered cold calls at midnight. I was the one who knew how the buyer liked his coffee, and which manager to call if someone needed to move a schedule at 2 a.m. "You're being dismissed," Cassidy announced, as if reciting policy. She loved policy the way others loved music, without emotion, but with an audience. The VP who'd once nodded at my ideas from across the table offered an impotent glance, then looked away. Security appeared like a stage mechanic dragging a curtain. I signed the termination form with the same calm I had signed lease agreements and non-disclosure addenda. I folded my hands, put the pen into the company-branded cup, and kept my face neutral in the way you learn to after enough meetings where your expression is the only leverage you have. They escorted me past the marble lobby, past the fountain that hummed like a refrigerator motor, past the receptionist who had my favorite brand of bottled water lined up behind the counter. People who had pretended not to notice me for years suddenly found reasons to look at their phones. Cassidy walked me out and did not once say the word sorry. She never had to. Entitlement doesn't need apologies. As I stood on the sidewalk, the city pressed in. Cabs fist. A courier shouted into a phone. Pigeons threaded the wires like punctuation. My hands were folded inside the leather of my coat. The cuff with the pearl buttons lay like an accusation. A woman with an expensive scarf held the elevator door for Cassidy. Cassidy stepped in with the ease of someone whose place in the world had been confirmed by a nod, a surname, a ledger entry. The elevator door closed on my face. I did not scream. I did not beg. I had already been rehearsing, in quieter rooms, how to survive larger betrayals than this. The dismissal felt small in mechanics, but enormous in reach. To them, it was a tidy little act of housekeeping. To me, it was an exposure. Everything I had built was suddenly, by their choice, vulnerable to the whims of someone who treated governance like an accessory. I went home and I packed like a person who had been trained by necessity to take only what mattered. There is a tenderness in deciding which things to carry when the rest of your life is being folded into someone else's narrative. I collected the tactile evidence of value, my notebook, the leather-bound thing with tabs that smelled faintly of tobacco and leftover espresso, the worn pen that had a small dent where I had dropped it on a rainy Tuesday in May during a negotiation that nearly broke a company, a slim portfolio with printed redactions, pages that read like history if you knew how to translate them. Paper becomes memory when the cloud won't do. I removed what I call my personal footprint. I logged out in ways that left a trail but no fingerprints. I did not smash servers or erase files. I did not need to write instructions about how to ruin things because that's not my method and it's not necessary in this story. I made sure that the things I needed to remain privately accessible remained private. The rest I left with the appearance of compliance. Keys on the table, card in the receptionist's tray, the badge with the chip, returned, clipped to the card holder, nothing dramatic. You can break someone's house of cards by touching one corner. You don't need a sledgehammer. Sarah, my assistant, texted me as I packed. She had been my inside voice for years, quiet, efficient, the kind of person who could untangle 30 calendars without mentioning it at dinner. Her message was brief. "Are you okay?" I replied with a single line that I found useful in such moments. "I'm fine. Don't come in tomorrow." I put the leather binder into the bottom drawer of the apartment bureau and locked it. The drawer was ordinary, not a safe, not theatrical. The binder contained the things they had been depending upon but had never bothered to understand. The list of people who remembered handshake terms more than contract text, the notes on how certain managers would actually deliver on promises under stress, the private number belonging to someone who does not file minutes. It was not an arsenal in the cinematic sense. It was institutional memory. It was the difference between legal title and operational practicality. It was leverage disguised as stationery. That evening, I watched the light go the color of cheap champagne over the tower where the acquisition would be signed the next morning. I thought about the building as a kind of animal, gleaming, hungry, a structure designed to eat weeks of focus and spit headlines. I imagined the board at the table, the seals to be pressed, the drinks to be poured, and somewhere in that choreography, the assumption that a promotion would mean nothing more than a new office plant. They had assumed I would disappear in a way they could control. They were wrong. If you like clean, cold revenge stories, hit follow. I spent the night in a small, strategic quiet. I did not drink. I smoked a cigarette on the fire escape, letting the city's cold press against my face while I thought in sequences. The memory of the room stayed with me like a smell: lemon cleaner, toner, faint cologne. I made a list in my notebook, not of grudge items, I'm classically uninterested in gratified cruelty, but of leverage points. Who would be hurt if the deal didn't close? Which sentences and which appendices depended on personal assurances, not printed clauses? Which players on the other side of the table had moods as much as mandates? There is always a stagehand, somewhere, moving things because of a rumor that someone might behave. Marcus Sterling, the buyer, did not run on rumor. Protocol had made him a man driven by terms and temper. He was not kind, but he was precise. I had met him 3 years earlier in a hotel lobby that smelled of orange oil and expensive paperbacks. He liked his deals clean, his people fewer, his opt-outs in small font. He appreciated competence and did not suffer posturing. He also kept an assistant named James who answered with an economy of syllables and managed his principal's appearances with a devotion bordering on religious discipline. Marcus was the kind of man who would withdraw from a deal at the merest whisper of mismanagement, because the calculus of his business was built on certainty that someone would deliver what had been promised, on time, with minimal drama. Marcus did not know me well. He knew my work. He had called me once at 2 a.m. when a vendor had tried to back out of a critical supply provision. He had listened, made a decisive call, and the vendor had stayed. That call made me a person in his ledger, useful, practical, reliable. He was not an ally you coaxed with sentiment. You earned a place on his calendar by not causing him to lose money. I needed Marcus to see a fact. The story Cassidy had told, one of inappropriate conduct and a mid-level morale problem, was a constructed excuse for removing an operational problem she could not control. I needed Marcus to understand that the firm he was about to buy would be more hollow than it looked without me present to translate between clause and execution. But you cannot call Marcus on a whim and expect sympathy. You call him with proof of something that matters to him. In our world, proof is often less a document than a live verification. A voice on the other end of a line, a person in a lobby, a confirming email written on company stationery. You do not send fireworks, you press an existing spark. I spent the next day in the places people don't see. Small cafes where no one recognized me. An art gallery with too bright lighting, where the guard was polite in a way that suggested indifference. The window of a bookstore. I put myself in the city at points where a passerby could be noticed and where a message could be received and relayed without drama. I turned my phone off and on in intervals, letting it be silent and then alive, like a watch that recharged. Text messages from the office started to come in the pattern of a panic that had not yet learned about the scale of the leak. Can you get on a quick call? Do you have the appendix? Who else has access? These were the small fires you expect people to throw at the person they think is the only one who can put them out. They thought me helpless. That is how they framed me to the new narrative. They had assumed I would buy into that framing. When I finally called Marcus, my voice was a calm instrument. I did not beg. I outlined a soft map, a list of operational dependencies, a note that the company's realized value hinged on a handful of deliverables that would not survive a management shakeup, and a single sentence that matters in calculations. If you proceed without the people who know how to operate this, you will not be buying a $1.5 billion machine.
You will be buying its name." Marcus, who liked to be brief, asked 3 questions and then said, "Show me." He did not use the word proof. His assistant, James, sent a curt acknowledgement. He then asked a logistical question about timing. He could not walk into a negotiation and pull out without risking his reputation. He could, however, be made to see a story that would make walking out the rational act. There are rules to theater and business. Actors don't need to be loud to be seen. You set the stage and let the audience make the verdict. I had 1 visible prop and 1 invisible hand. The prop was me, on the street, alive and unbowed. The hand was a phone number and the chain of small promises that, if publicly contradicted, would render months of testimony into a contradiction. Here's what they didn't see coming. The binder in my drawer was not a demonstration of spite. It was a ledger of relational capital, the sort of thing contracts capture in a sentence but not in practice. The binder listed the people whose signatures mattered less in ink and more in history. It listed the 4 regional directors who honored an oral side letter signed with a beer-sodden handshake in a hotel bar in Osaka. It contained the name of the project manager who would not prioritize deliveries unless you spoke to her direct late at night. Those names were the hinges that held the deal's operations together. Remove the hinges and the doors still stand, they just don't open. Marcus did not need every name. He needed to know that they existed and that someone who had stewarded them was no longer at the table.
He needed to see that the promise of continuity was breaking into 100 late-night emails that no longer carried the weight of a steady hand. We arranged a small, surgical visibility. James would be with Marcus the next morning, crossing the threshold of the tower to finalize the acquisition. I would be in sight, close enough to be recognized, distanced enough to avoid accusation. The plan was not cinematic. There was no dramatic planting of evidence. It was much better, a contradiction. Cassidy's narrative was that I had been thrown out because of conduct. If there were a living, breathing, available person who had the operational knowledge the buyer wanted, then the buyer's calculus would shift. If Marcus saw me, and if his team received a message from James about seeing me alive, then the story would collapse into cognitive dissonance. How could the people they were buying be simultaneously incompetent and vital? I told Marcus where I'd be standing. He consented. James confirmed. Marcus asked that I stay visible but not approach them. He did not want me to create a scene. He wanted my presence to serve as a fact. No theatrics, he said. Just be where you can be seen. That phrase, no theatrics, was crucial. It folded restraint into strategy. The most devastating moves in corporate life are surgical because they leave little for the other side to deny. Public displays invite counter-theaters. Quiet facts leave silence as an unforgiving commentator. As I arranged myself across from the tower, across from the place where glass turned office hours into theater light, I noticed that Cassidy had prepared an undeniable story for anyone who asked, a tidy narrative of professionalism enforced by standards. It was the sort of story that reads well in press releases. It smells of prudence, but its architecture was brittle. It relied on the public believing that the house was being kept tidy, not cleaned out to hide rot. I chose a cafe with a large window facing the tower. It had a brass espresso machine and trained baristas who never asked too many questions. I ordered something ordinary and sought with nothing more ostentatious than a paperback and a cup. My suit was new in a way that didn't announce, "Look at me," a quiet navy that read as competent, not flashy. I did not look for eyes. I looked at the reflection of the building and thought about how many people had assumed that the person who does the work is interchangeable. A week earlier on a Wednesday afternoon that would now feel like a different life, a junior analyst had said in passing, "They like faces they can speak for on the golf course." I had not been surprised. Many of the men in that room had been choosing faces instead of skills. Cassidy had a face that fit their narratives. She did not have the work. She had a surname and the ability to perform the right tone. That would not be sufficient if a more profitable calculus presented itself.
The day pressed on in the way of days when significant transactions are scheduled, slow at first, then snapping with sudden messages. My phone remained mostly off. At precisely the point when the lobby would be filling with the kind of people who sign papers and smile well on camera, my phone buzzed like a small machine. "James, on site. Marcus is with me. He saw you." There was a careful economy in the message, efficient, devoid of commentary, a thing of tradecraft. He did not type exclamation points. He did not add adjectives. He transmitted the fact. Cassidy's narrative, prepared earlier in the day, did not account for living contradiction. She had told a handful of board members that there had been a disruption and that she had acted for the company's image. She had expected a ripple at worst, some internal gossip, a newsletter memo, a brief period of awkwardness at the holiday party. She had not planned for a buyer who used presence as a metric. On the sidewalk, 2 stories were happening at the same time. In the glass tower, a man named Marcus was calibrating his risk. Across the street,
Someone who had been dismissed for the color of her buttons watched a small crowd flow and a marble floor that would soon reflect the collapse of an assumption. People were filing into elevators like animals into a corral, unaware of the landlord about to pull a gate. I did not feel vindictive. There is a difference between vindictiveness and correction. Vindictiveness sees revenge as an end unto itself. Correction sees it as restoring a ledger. I had no desire to humiliate for pleasure. I wanted to rebalance the market of expectations. The first public reactions were small and precise. A board member's mouth that had been smiling now pressed into a line. The CFO's hand trembled as he unlocked his phone. The security team, who had been trained to follow a script of removal and discretion, found themselves in the perverse position of being the only instrument left that could keep two incompatible narratives from colliding. In their hands sat the question, do we enforce a story, or do we acknowledge the fact in front of us? From my seat, I watched the tower like an animal that does not know it is about to be tripped. I thought of the $1.5 billion figure the headlines would eventually use, the number that had been polished and rehearsed in investor slides. They had conflated brand with operation, and expected the buyer to mistake the shine for solidity. It is a mistake investors hate to make. Marcus hated it enough to walk away if he thought he had been sold only the facade. James texted again. Marcus wants you to remain visible. We will not make a scene. Do not approach. Do not approach. The phrase felt like a bell. It signaled restraint. It implied that the moment would be measured not by noise, but by the gravity of contradiction. There were small hand signs, the sort of cues people miss when they are in the rush of survival.
A board member lifted his brow at Cassidy. Someone clicked their pen a little too loudly. The receptionist, who was a younger woman with a meticulous bun, glanced up and then down, as if asked to choose whether to look away or to stare. I ordered another coffee and let the steam fog the window a little. In that fog, the building took on the look of something about to be revised. My phone vibrated with another message. This time the content was different, less about logistics, more about the morphology of a decision. James, Marcus wants to talk after. He will call if anything shifts. I set the cup down. The ceramic felt warm under my fingers. The city hummed its usual soundtrack. Horns, the distant clatter of a delivery, a dog barking. It is curious how the world's ordinary noises make the extraordinary feel like a misfiled memorandum. You can keep breathing between pulses of events and realize how attached everyone is to the noise. A woman at the next table swiped through headlines on her feed. She paused, interested, then scrolled past. People see what they expect to see. This is why small, surgical disruptions matter. They force different expectations. Inside the tower, Cassidy was now running the script of escalation. She leaned on the idea of control, that removing me was an act of governance. She expected gratitude, or at least silence. She did not expect the buyer to see a person with a ledger instead of a vacancy. I thought of the morning when I had signed the termination form as if it were a condolence card. I had worn the same composed face that had gotten me through other humiliations, the conference call with a partner who wanted a favor, the quarter-end review where someone took credit. Humiliation in corporate life is usually done slowly, by attrition. This had been a compressed humiliation, performed on the stage of a large glass room. It was meant to be theatrical and to settle like a public fact, but facts like contradiction do not settle. The coffee cooled. A bus pulled up 2 blocks down, and the woman with the scarf stepped out, phone to ear, the way people rehearse their composure. I folded my hands around the warm cup. I had arranged the smallest of things, my position, my timing, my restraint, so that the world's interest could collate into a single observable point. I had no illusions about theatrical romance. I knew how to work with the arithmetic of leverage. One well-timed perception could force a chain reaction. And then the phone vibrated with the first public provocation. A text from an unknown number to an old distribution list at the firm had leaked, an almost trivial thing, a short message suggesting their buyer had concerns about operational continuity. Nothing explicit, nothing legal. In the world of big deals, rumors are like tiny cracks in a dam. They do not need to be large to cause water to find new channels. The office reaction was immediate, tactical. Calls to lawyers, revised talking points, a frantic scheduling of an emergency meeting. Cassidy swept toward the door of the elevator like a woman fleeing a sudden storm. She had not expected the storm to be weathered by the very people she had expected to follow the script.
I watched through the glass as a senior partner, someone who'd formerly offered me a mentorship and now avoided eye contact, tried to reconcile the call on his phone with the person sipping coffee across the street. There is a peculiar cruelty when people must choose between a convenient narrative that validates their choices and an inconvenient truth that threatens their investments. Most of them chose the narrative until forced otherwise. My phone vibrated again. James, Marcus is standing up. He is asking questions. Not yet. Wait. There it was, a pause long enough to let the tension settle into a held breath. I set the cup down, palms against the rim, the ceramic rash of warmth grounding me in the moment. I felt an odd detachment, like the satisfaction of someone watching a well-played chess game who knows that the final sequence will be inevitable once the right pieces have been nudged. In the lobby now, elevators loaded and dissolved like soft punctuation. Conversations became fragments. A PR handler smoothed a script. The CFO's hand ran a nervous pattern along his jaw. Cassidy, who had orchestrated my removal, was now trying to orchestrate a counter-narrative, flinging the nets of explanation she had prepared months earlier. She said words into a phone, the voice transmitted as if on a wire. She performed competence. But competence in these rooms is sometimes a matter of optics more than action. The function of a leader in a big deal is to be a believable constant. When the buyer perceives the constant as unreliable, the mathematics of value shifts. A $1.5 billion valuation is not just arithmetic, it is trust multiplied by expectations about execution. Remove the faith in execution, and the number becomes a brittle thing. Marcus asked a public question. It was not loud, but it carried. Is she here? James answered with a single sentence that landed like a verdict. From across the street, I watched as the lobby contracted. Telephones were put down. Someone gasped, the soft sound of a person whose internal ledger did not reconcile with observation. Cassidy's color changed in a way that made her look suddenly younger, stripped of the polished armor she'd been wearing for the performance. And then, as if the world had decided on a point of clarity, Marcus did something he had not yet done on the day he had come to evaluate the purchase. He stood. The weight of the moment was mechanical. Standing is a small human action, but in those rooms it is as significant as a gavel. People looked up. The elevator door closed on a cascade of faces. The boardroom became a theater, and the theater had found its fact. I took a breath and felt the city align around the small axis I had put in place. It is a peculiar sensation, the recognition that you have done the necessary quiet work and are now watching the world respond. Part of me cataloged the efficiency of the reaction. Who moved first? Who hesitated? Who reached for a script? Part of me listened to the sound of silence, the kind of silence a metallic building makes just before it announces a chapter was broken. My phone buzzed again. James, Marcus is in the lobby. He wants to see you. No approach. Let the observation do its work. I looked up at the building's facade. The glass reflected my image like a question. I could see, in the reflection, a woman who had been described as expendable, and a woman who, in the arithmetic of experience, held indispensable knowledge. The city continued to hum around the tableau of human behavior. A delivery truck idled. Someone laughed in a bar several stories up. A pair of runners slipped past. Life shrugged at the edges of the event and went on, convinced that it could absorb the shock. The elevator doors opened, and out came Marcus with the economy of a man who had made decisions before breakfast and slept well afterward. His presence rearranged the room. Cassidy's earlier confidence flickered. She had counted on an audience that responded to narrative, not fact. Facts in a lobby are hard to stage manage. My phone vibrated once more, a single line that crystallized the next move. James, Marcus wants to talk after this. He wants names and assurances. I sat very still. The coffee in my hand had nearly gone cold. My binder remained locked in the drawer at my apartment, a quiet testament to the fact that not all value is displayed on quarterly charts. I had not planned to humiliate anyone. I had planned to present a correction. A buyer deserved to know what he was buying. The final clicks before the reveal were small. A shoe tapping, a secretary's inhale, the ring of a distant phone. The lobby had contracted into a hush that felt like a held breath. The first major choice had been made. Marcus was present. Cassidy was standing on evidence of her own making. The room had not collapsed yet, but the architecture of the deal had been unsettled. People now had to reconcile the fact of me with the narrative they had sold each other. My phone's battery dwindled. The message that came next was neither triumphant nor plaintive. It was precise, the way an invoice is precise and unforgiving. James, Marcus just texted. He's seeing discrepancies. He asked if we have a time to talk in person after this. Stay visible. I picked up my cup and felt the rim, the heat, the ordinary texture of ceramic. The world for a moment looked like a ledger, columns of what people thought would happen and what actually did. The gap between them is where consequence lives.
Outside, the glass of the tower reflected a woman who had been dismissed for the way she dressed, and who had chosen to dress in a quiet navy that did not scream. Inside the tower, men and women with practiced smiles were recalculating. The $1.5 billion number, which had been polished until it shone, had become vulnerable, not because someone shouted, but because presence had contradicted narrative. I settled deeper into my chair, folded my hands, and felt for the first time since that conference room a thin line of satisfaction that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with agency. The plan had been modest and careful. It was not about making a spectacle. It was about restoring the truth. And then my phone vibrated with a single text I had not expected, a shorthand that signaled the shift from possibility to movement. James, Marcus is asking to speak now. He wants a list. He wants verification. He will call you in 5. I let the cup cool on the table and closed my eyes for a second, feeling the hum of the city like an electrical current through my ribs. The next sequence would be loud in its consequences, even if it remained silent in its performance. Contracts would need to be reconsidered. Advisors would be off script. The $1.5 billion valuation could reframe into a smaller number if execution now seemed at risk. I knew the arithmetic. I had been through the calculations in my head the way a seamstress measures fabric. Precise, necessary. The chair across from me was empty. I rose and walked to the window, leaning into the glass to see the lobby below. Tiny figures moved like chess pieces. The air held the smell of leather and citrus, and the faint ozone of too many fluorescent bulbs. My phone vibrated again in my hand, and the incoming call blinked Marcus Sterling's name in letters that felt like a judge's notation. I swallowed and answered. My voice did not tremble. I had been preparing for this call for the last 12 hours, and for the career that had preceded that. I had been writing down names in the quiet of my apartment, cataloging the soft architecture of expectations. Marcus and I spoke like professionals who recognize the calculus of risk. His first words were not incendiary. They were a question about reliability. He asked what it would take to be certain that the person who'd done the work could ensure the deal's continuity. I did not offer a dramatic pitch. I offered a map. I spoke of people who would need to be contacted directly, of who would actually run the project after signatures, and of the intangible assurances that made the numbers palatable to operational tolerances. Marcus listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for numbers and long-form math. I could hear the cogs in his mind: strategy, reputation, follow-through. When the call ended, he said, "Stay where you are. We will be in touch in 10. He hung up. I looked through the window at the lobby again. The room had not yet erupted. The chain reaction, if it was to happen, would be surgical. I had set a lawful little trap. The truth, presented calmly, can be more damning than a shout. I sat back down and folded my hands around the cooling coffee. In the glass, my reflection looked like a ledger balanced, a woman who had been dismissed, packing the things that had been useful, and who had not allowed the dismissal to remove her options. There is a small triumph in recalibrating one's own narrative against the forces that manage reputation. Outside, someone laughed in the street, oblivious to the shifting tectonics behind the tower's polished skin. Inside, people were realigning their talking points. Cassidy, who had performed governance, now had to confront the fact that governance is not merely about enforcement, but about custody of capability. She had assumed the latter came with a status. It had not. My phone chimed with a new message, and the world narrowed to the letters appearing on the screen. James, Marcus is on his way up. Expect him in 10. I let the message sit like a match held to something prepared to smolder. The moment I had been constructing, methodical, patient, absolutely devoid of melodrama, was approaching its point of demonstration. The lobby's sound had already thinged. Small conversations were being absorbed into the larger sound of consequence. People were no longer asking what had happened. They were looking for what would happen next. I rose, smoothed my coat,
set a single $50 bill on the saucer, and left it there like a quiet signature. The cafe's barista glanced up and smiled with the practiced anonymity of someone who understands the theater of cities. I walked across the street and stood where I could be seen through the lobby's glass wall without entering it. The marble reflected my image, refracted it like evidence given for inspection. There are moments when the world behaves like a ledger, and you get to write the first line. I did not feel triumphant in a childish way. I felt accurate. Something that had been mispriced in their accounts of me now sat back on the scale, measured. The glass door opened and the lobby inhaled, as if expecting something to be decided in that breath. My phone vibrated with a final message that would act as the hinge into the next sequence. "James, Marcus is here. He just asked Cassidy a question." She looked surprised. I took another breath and let the city sounds wash over me, steady and indifferent, while the thing I had set into motion prepared to reveal itself in the most public room of the building. The lobby air thickens when Marcus stops in front of Cassidy. He does not shout. He never shouts. He has the economy of a man who understands that volume is cheap and consequence is costly. He folds his coat, looks at the faces around him, direct, efficient, and then, without theatrics, asks, "Why was she removed?"
Cassidy's confidence, which had been tailored and pressed for public viewing, froze in real time. She had rehearsed corporate speak, protocol, standards, a necessary removal to protect the brand. None of those words are bad on their own. They are a kind of insurance, but insurance fails when the claim does not match the loss. She starts with, "It was a matter of," and then the phrase gives way to a patchwork of policy and anecdote, all of it thin in the face of a man whose business is built on certainty. "Show me the evidence," Marcus says. His voice is small, practical. He wants a document, a paper trail, an HR memo. He'd asked for proof the night before and been given charts and assurances. Now he is asking the people present for an answer that reconciles the visible with the narrative. The discrepancy is obvious. If a trusted operator can be publicly dismissed for a wardrobe misstep and yet be essential to operations, someone has been misrepresenting the asset. Cassidy gestures toward the boardroom, toward the team she'd already briefed. A partner offers a clipped sentence about discipline and image. A counsel, who had been rostered to manage the PR, murmurs a line about ongoing investigation. The words land like leaves, decorative, then dead. Marcus looks at the counsel and shakes his head minutely. "We were promised continuity," he says. "We were promised people who could run the operation from day one. We were not promised a house of mirrors where the reflection changes depending on whose name is on a badge." He does two things in quick succession that the room hasn't yet prepared for. First, he instructs James, quietly, to forward the message they received earlier, the note suggesting concerns about operational continuity, to his legal advisor with an addendum, "We need confirmation of access and continuity right now." Second, he asks aloud, "Is Emily present?" The question lands like a bell. Someone by the elevator swallows. Cassidy's mouth opens and closes. For a beat, the lobby is a held breath. Then, from across the street, a receptionist who had been scanning faces points out the window. There, in the glass box of the cafe, is the woman they had dismissed. That physical fact, a living person placed visible in a field of doubt, does something more powerful than any memo. The presence contradicts the tidy narrative Cassidy had supplied. It is a simple, undeniable friction. In the calculus of deals, presence is evidence. Marcus nods at James. "Confirm what you saw," he says. James types a brief line and sends it. In less than a minute, Marcus's phone pings with a terse confirmation. Saw her, seated, in view. You can count the room's responses by micro-movements. A partner dropping his pen, the CFO's fingers retreating from his phone, a security officer shifting his posture, as if considering whether to enforce a story or to let truth unfold.
Cassidy's face goes a peculiar color, less red than pallid, the sheen of someone suddenly exposed under a bright light. "On what grounds was she let go?" Marcus asks again. The question is not rhetorical. He wants a defensible explanation, because defensibility is the currency his corporation trades in. Cassidy's rehearsed answer collapses into a staccato of policy jargon and a plea to trust the board's decision. Trust is a fragile derivative. It evaporates when observable facts contradict PR. This is the surgical moment I'd been working toward. No shouting matches, no viral videos, just a quiet, inexorable weighing of credibility. People in that room begin to murmur. A junior associate leans in and says too loudly, "The buyer's going to want guarantees."
A PR rep adjusts her papers as if to hide the tremor. The CFO, who has spent all morning projecting steady cash flow and accretion analyses, looks suddenly younger and small. Marcus does not need to ask to see internal documents. He knows enough to trigger a cascade. Tell your legal team to pull up operational metrics, call your project leads, confirm deliverable sequences. He is, in effect, asking the company to perform competence in front of an audience that now suspects it may be absent. Cassidy scrambles. For the first time since she strapped on the performance of authority, she is scrambling without the habits of competence. She gestures toward the security staff, says something about protocol, then tries to pivot to a line about preserving confidentiality. It reads as evasive. In corporate theaters, evasions are stronger indicators of risk than any rumor. James sends another message. Marcus reads it, and his face hardens in the precise way a financier's face hardens when numbers shift. There are discrepancies in who has operational control, he tells the room. My team cannot reconcile the assurances we've been given with what I'm seeing here. It is then that the CFO, who had been hoping to steer a path through panic with numbers, interjects with a defensible but inadequate reflex. We have counsel engaged. We'll provide documentation. He glances at his phone as if to summon the document, but his hands betray him. His fingers are shaking. The effect is cumulative. Investors, even in private deals, are allergic to ambiguity. Marcus could have absorbed a small misstep. He cannot absorb a misrepresentation in the face of a visible contradiction. Deals depend on the transference of risk, and when the true risk cannot be quantified because it rests on people rather than on measured assets, the calculus changes. He stands up. The room focuses. He does not say, "We're done." He says, "I need time to reassess our position." The phrasing is cool. The meaning is not. Time, in this market, is a mechanism that allows other parties to walk away, to recalculate, to withdraw commitments quietly.
Within 30 minutes, whispers transform into phone calls, and the hallways out beyond the lobby become conduits for retreat. The bank that had been prepared to underwrite a tranche asks for an immediate conference call. A legal advisor recommends pausing signatures until operational certainty is confirmed. One by one, perfunctory commitments are shelved as contingencies are reasserted. The $1.5 billion figure, the headline metric that had once been neat and authoritative, begins to look like a conditional sum that depends on people to make it real. You cannot watch a confident valuation dissolve without noticing how quickly narratives hinge on small certainties. A missing operational hand turns a rosy forecast into an exercise in damage control. Markets do not like uncertainty. Parties prefer to renegotiate when they can. Within hours, the language in the private threads shifts from expected close to pending further due diligence. In other words, the deal is not dead yet, but it is much more vulnerable, and in vulnerability lies the potential to be repriced. Cassidy pleads with Marcus in front of the room, her voice higher now. She attempts to assert that her actions were in the company's best interest. Marcus listens without flinching. He acknowledges her, then asks for further evidence. She cannot provide it. There are no emails, no signed memos explaining why the person who managed operations was removed the day before a closing. There are only performative notes about image and decorum. Performative reasons do not shore up operational risk. The first real fracture is procedural. Someone mentions the conditionality in a clause nobody had expected to be invoked. Key man assurances. It is language that undergirds many deals, the idea that certain individuals are critical to performance. That sentence had been drafted in the appendices, vestigial, an insurance policy that rarely sees the light of day. It now becomes the knife edge. If a buyer suspects that these key individuals are at risk, the whole premium that made the $1.5 billion figure imaginable shrinks. You do not need a public announcement to cause a valuation to fall. You simply need a capable buyer to refuse to move forward until the risk is mitigated. Marcus chooses to step back. He does not storm out like a scene in a movie. He stands, gathers his things with a precision that reads as finality, and says, "We'll reconvene you after due diligence." He does not say, "We walked away," but his words permit the market to make that translation. Outside, investors and advisors are pragmatic and fast. Within the day, the messaging cycle alters. Murmurs about a pause, then speculation about repricing, then a tentative offer rescinded. The company's market perception, among those who trade in rumor and risk, starts to ache. A $1.5 billion headline is a fragile ornament when the operational scaffolding supporting it falters.
Inside the tower, the boardroom collapses into a quieter, more desperate calculus. The CFO's hand runs over his face.
The VP, who had once admired Cassidy, now looks petulant and small. Someone mentions damage control and reputational mitigation. The board begins a sequence of calls, to lenders, to advisors, to the buyer's council. The word restructure is spoken like a threat. Cassidy's father, a VP who had leveraged his name the way people leverage a clean signature, emerges from the back room. His expression is a man who has seen a plan pivot into chaos and discovered that his social capital is less liquid than he'd assumed. You can see the arithmetic of entitlement erode in his features. No one apologizes. No one takes a public bow. They are, all of them, professionals in a panic. I watch the room remap itself. It is not cruelty, it is observation. People who have spent years doing their work learn to read the small signals that indicate larger motions. Marcus has applied the simplest of tests. Does the living person exist, with the knowledge necessary to make this thing run? If the answer is yes, then the buyer's risk, his prime concern, shifts to how to secure that knowledge. If the answer is no, the numbers rearrange. When the decision trickles out, careful, private, phrased in the language of additional diligence required, the consequence becomes visible in spreadsheets and in the faces behind them. Offers recalibrate. A once warm underwriter grows cold. Talk of a discount arises not as malice but as arithmetic. When execution risk increases, value declines. An offer that might have been assured at headline terms now slashes in margin. A buyer recalculates and sees that acquiring the company as is would be less valuable than previously estimated. That is the moment the market translates insecurity into a dollar figure. It is not instantaneous, but by the end of the day, the conversation on the trading desks and in the council's private chats centers on revised expectations. How much should a rational buyer now offer for assets whose success depends on uncertain human capital? What follows is not theater so much as the clacking of practical machines. Calls, recalculated models, quiet back channels to figure out new prices. Deals are not emotional, they are arithmetic. When the arithmetic changes, the offers do too. The $1.5 billion headline becomes a variable with a large error bar. Marcus waits until he can step away without causing the spectacle of a dramatic retreat. He never wanted to make an enemy of the people in the room. He wanted to avoid a purchase that mispriced risk. His walking away, protocol, measured, simply releases the rest of the market to reassess. When a buyer of his scale hesitates, other parties listen. That afternoon, the company's valuation under negotiation is discussed in terms that feel smaller and sharper.
Firms that had once nodded in private now begin using phrases like, "We might be able to acquire this division at a significant discount." One partner calculates, out loud, 30 cents on the dollar, maybe less given the operational gaps. The number lands like a threshold. On a $1.5 billion baseline, 30% is approximately $450 million. That is the arithmetic of repricing when confidence collapses. I do not cheer at the math. I see it as correction. I had not sought to bankrupt anyone. I had sought only to restore valuation to a place that matched reality. Valuation that pretends not to depend on people is a dishonest arithmetic. My move had been surgical, not to injure, but to clarify. When the deal did not close that evening, the public relations teams moved into their rehearsed roles. Press statements were drafted that night with cautious language. Mutual decision to pause, additional due diligence required. Investors who sleep poorly repositioned. Internally, the company called an emergency session. Council recommended a review, and perhaps at minimum an internal look at governance. Cassidy retreated behind statements and a shade of dignity that had been eroded by the visible contradiction. But what I had engineered was not simply a collapse, it was an opening. Marcus, an investor who values competence over performative control, saw not only the risk but also the opportunity. Later, as the boardroom emptied into the evening, James texted me. Marcus would like to speak privately in the cafe. Do not come in. He will meet you outside. The phrasing was careful. Marcus respected boundaries. He also respected results. We met in a side street where the air smelled faintly of diesel and lemon from a nearby dry cleaner. He did not reach for the high drama of apology. He began by saying two things that only men who have built empires care to say. First,
I keep my calendar for people who can actually run things. And second, you are dismissed publicly for something trivial, and privately you are instrumental. He made an offer that was both pragmatic and generous in the way of seasoned capitalists. He proposed that I join his firm as a senior operating partner with a mandate to rebuild operational continuity in businesses where execution was at risk. More concretely, he proposed that his holding company would look to acquire the core operational assets of the firm, those parts whose value depended on people and institutional memory, at a negotiated discount reflective of the newly perceived risk. He mentioned the phrase that had been bandied about in the room that afternoon, 30 cents on the dollar, as a possible starting point for negotiation. In plain terms, a potential path to gain stewardship, not just of a role, but of the operations themselves, at an acquisition price scaled to the new realities. He did not sweeten the offer with melodrama.
There were terms: equity participation, operational budgets, a mandate to rebuild and repurpose. He wanted someone who knew how to move people and process through ambiguity. He wanted someone who understood that tie-breaking calls at midnight were where value is made or lost. He wanted me to lead teams, to design the playbook, to have the authority to hire and fire within reason. He also wanted, privately, a say in who would control the transition. The fiscal lever, an ability to acquire key assets at a significant discount, was part of that power. It was the sort of offer that turns humiliation into agency. He was offering me not merely a job, but a seat at a table where the leverage was no longer hidden in someone else's binder, but was transacted, recognized, and supplied with capital. It was a chance to convert my institutional memory into an equity stake. I considered the offer on the street, the city breathing around us. I thought of the binder in my drawer, of the people whose names it contained, and of the peculiarity of being rewarded for quiet competence when the world finally notices you. It was not revenge, it was recompense. The arithmetic of the deal meant that I could, if I chose, buy a part of what had been mispriced and rebuild it properly. Marcus was careful not to promise the world. He used disclaimers like a craftsman uses tape. This is contingent, subject to diligence. We'll need to ensure regulatory compliance. He spoke in terms of possibility, not inevitability. That was enough. Possibilities are what capitalists trade in, the ability to move value from one state to a more accurate one. We negotiated the contours in minutes that felt like hours. I did not ask for a vanity title. I asked for authority, for resources, and for a credible path to ownership. He offered a compensation package, an operating budget, and a purchase option on assets at an agreed-upon multiple of revised valuations, subject to standard diligence and board approval. We agreed in principle on structure. He would present a term sheet the next morning. He would not, he said, use the night to leverage shame. His firm had no interest in public spectacle. He was offering me a path, not to humiliate my former company further, but to build something sturdier. When I walked back to my apartment that night, the city had the soft electric smell of rain. I unlocked the drawer in the dim of the hallway and touched the leather binder the way you touch a ledger that has kept your life intact. I did not imagine a revenge parade. I imagined a plan. Buy the assets that actually moved value, rebuild the teams, create continuity where someone else had mistaken surface for substance. The next day, Marcus's term sheet arrived, clean, efficient, and realistic. The offer contemplated either a direct hire with operating authority that included an option to purchase core delivery units at roughly 30% of the earlier headline valuation of the whole enterprise, or, if the corporate governance resisted, a standalone carve-out purchase of those operational units. He left the path open. Both options required diligence and legal oversight. Both required me to sign on to a long-term operational mandate. Both gave me leverage back, and not in the form of petty payback, but in the form of actual capital and stewardship. I took the role. I did not take it for satisfaction derived from watching others stumble. I took it because the alternative, returning to a seat where my agency was contingent on someone else's whim, was intolerable. I negotiated not to punish, but to ensure value would be rebuilt in a responsible manner. I wanted to prove, practically, that institutional memory was not a sentimental relic, but an asset that could be monetized with integrity. The days that followed were procedural and intense. We sat in conference rooms that smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee and set up teams. We drafted integration plans, assigned leads, and drew up communication protocols that respected employees' dignity. Marcus's approach was austere but competent.
measure the deliverables, identify retention targets, offer transition contracts to key people, and provide budgets for rebuilding. Where the company had relied on the illusion of stability, we proposed the architecture of real continuity. There were legal and ethical gates to navigate. We moved carefully, not to exploit a moment of weakness for the sake of cruelty, but to seize an opportunity for restructuring that would preserve jobs and create a company that functioned rather than merely represented value. There is a moral line in these transactions. I did not cross it. I insisted on fairness clauses for retained staff and a path for the broader company to propose counteroffers that would retain their operational teams should they care to match ours. The press wrote what it writes, a tidy narrative about a deal that stalled and an investor who pivoted. Some outlets used the language of collapse as a hook, others spoke of repricing and restructuring. Inside, we spoke in the language of budgets and retention. The $1.5 billion headline lingered like a ghost. The reality we were buying into was more granular and, in its own way, healthier. We were not buying a shimmer. We were buying a functioning apparatus. At the first board meeting after the pause, Cassidy's father attempted to rally his allies. There were accusations and defensive motions. There were questions about how this happened and timeline. I spoke little. When I did, it was to explain, plainly, what continuity required. Named leads, retained budgets, explicit performance metrics. My tone was not triumphalist. It was instructional. This was my work.
The board listened, and many of them were embarrassed to discover how fragile their assumptions had been. Entitlement is efficient until it meets the arithmetic of execution. Marcus's acquisition moved in fits and starts. We offered the core operating assets a purchase option at roughly 30 cents on the previous headline valuation, a figure that reflected both the newly perceived risk and the capital needed to rebuild. That number, ugly as it sounded to an audience that had been spoon-fed the magic of headlines, was realistic. It allowed us to rebuild the people functions without pretending the world had not shifted. I negotiated terms that included protections for employees, including retention bonuses and transparent reporting structures. I insisted that any transaction be structured to preserve jobs and to ensure that the people who actually did the work would be recognized as stakeholders, not as collateral in some theatrical transfer. Marcus respected that. Part of his assessment of me as a partner was that I would not burn bridges that we'd later need to cross. Weeks later, a deal was struck. Not the $1.5 billion behemoth the market had once imagined, but a responsible purchase that reflected the cost of ensuring continuity and the capital required to make the operations actually hum. The headlines that had been poised to celebrate a $1.5 billion acquisition instead chronicled a buyer's pivot, a reprice, and a new leadership team tasked with salvaging operational integrity. Some commentators called it a collapse. I called it a correction. On my first day on the new payroll, I stood in an office that had the sterile smell of a place recently painted and professionally dusted. The furniture was sensible, the plants were real. Marcus handed me an old brass key that opened a file cabinet. "We buy what functions," he said, almost to himself, "and then we make it function better." I smiled, not because I enjoyed the damage, but because I had been given the means to restore value with the people who actually created it. There is a quiet satisfaction in executing a plan that does not rely on spectacle. I did not crow, I built. I hired people back when it made sense. I dismissed people when they were demonstrably incompetent, and I retained those whose institutional knowledge mattered. I wrote memos and then rewrote them into action. The work was granular, mundane, and deeply satisfying. The moral is not that the entitled should be punished in public. The moral is that competence, executed patiently and without bluster, can convert a shameful expulsion into an opportunity. I traded the theater of apology for the ledger of authority. I did not seek cruelty, I sought correction. A year later, I walked past the tower where I'd once been escorted out. The marble lobby still gleamed. There were still people who measured the world by the shine of their shoes.
I had a new suit then, cut by people who understood that garments can be functional as well as flattering. I had a key to a company that ran on the precise, boring work of getting things done. Cassidy's name lingered in certain circles. Her father kept his post for a while longer. Titles are not, in themselves, measures of mastery. There was gossip, and there always will be, but gossip makes a poor foundation for operations. The rebuild was messy and human. We made hard calls. We honored those who deserved it. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the way things played out. Regret for what? For refusing to be erased? For deciding the ledger should reflect truth? No. I regret only that it took so many polite assumptions to be unveiled before people learned to value the work that keeps a business breathing.
In the end, the story that mattered was not the public shouting or the headline arithmetic, but the small, steady work of reconstruction. Dignity is not an ornament, it is a functional asset. Competence is not theatrical, it is the thing that reduces risk. When you convert invisible labor into visible authority, you do more than vindicate yourself. You build something that endures beyond the moment. I left the company formally, with a modest stake in what we had purchased and the mandate to run it well. I did not gloat. I moved on with the calm that comes from having acted in accordance with one's principles. I walked out wearing a suit that fit, with a leather bag and the quiet sense of a woman who had turned a dismissal into an opportunity to rewrite her terms. If you liked the way this played out, if the quiet arithmetic of patience and leverage appeals to you, subscribe for more stories from the margins of power. These are not tales of spectacle. They are accounts of how competence finds its way back into the ledger if you know where to look.